Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the last lecture of the lecture series of Rice University's Center for African American Studies. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Michelle Moyd. Dr. Moyd is Ruth and Hall's Associate Professor of History at Indiana University, Bloomington. She earned PhD in African History from Cornell University in 2008. Dr. Moyd is the author of Violent Intermediaries, African Soldiers, Conquest, and Everyday Colonialism in German East Africa, published by Ohio University Press in 2014. She also co-authored Linguistic Disobedience, Restoring Power to Civic Language with Yulia Kamska and David Bramley, published by Paul Grave in 2018. Dr. Moyd is Associate Professor or Associate Director of the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society at Indiana University. She is currently working on a new book project called Africa, Africans in the First World War. This book is under contract with Cambridge University Press for the New Approaches to African History series. Additionally, Dr. Moyd is researching Black soldiers who fought for the German, British, and US empires from 1870 to 1920 as part of a new book project of us. Before I turn the word to Dr. Moyd, please let me remind our listeners that questions or comments are welcome through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen during any time of the lecture. Dr. Jacqueline Couti, our esteemed colleague from the Department of Modern and Classical Languages and Cultures, and a faculty affiliate of the Center for African and African American Studies here at Rice, will be moderating the Q&A session. Zoom lectures often tend to end abruptly, so I'd like to register here our gratitude and appreciation for Dr. Moyd's lecture and for everybody who made this event possible. Thank you very much. Dr. Moyd, the virtual floor is now yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Domingues. And I'd also like to thank Professor Pinn for inviting me to give this talk last year and for being patient enough with me when some family issues arose to reschedule for this semester. I'd also like to thank Neva Agunobi for the Zoom help and looking forward to Dr. Couti's moderation. So thank you all for all of your work in getting me here, and thanks to everyone here who's watching, especially at this busy time of year. I'm going to plan to speak for about 40 minutes, and I will look forward to your questions and comments on what is really work in progress, so I invite any and all feedback. So let me share my screen and get started. So the title of my paper is John Chilembwe's War, Reading Anti-Colonial Resistance in Malawi's First World War. And this is going to be a book chapter in an edited volume on kind of ways of framing the First World War. And my contribution is, I think, probably the only Africa contribution in the book. So what I'm trying to do is use this example as a way into opening up some ideas about how we think of Africa and the First World War. I'll start by just doing a very brief geographic overview. I'm going to be talking today about what was then called Nyasaland. Today it's Malawi. At a certain point, I'll be talking about kind of this border region between German East Africa and Nyasaland. So that's the kind of big picture. More close in to Malawi in a more regionally specific map. You can see up here the place I just pointed to on the big map, Karonga, where a major battle of World War I took place within the first month of the war beginning in 1914. And then on this map, I've marked two places. So this is in southern Malawi, down here, this region. The first one is Mbombwe, where John Chilembwe's Providence Industrial Mission Church was built, where his congregation worshiped. And then here at Magomero, which is next to the Bruce Estates, which was a cotton plantation. So all of these locations play a part in my talk. So I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview before we start. Okay, so in January 1915, in the Shire Highlands of Nyasaland, today Malawi, members of the Baptist pastor John Chilembwe's congregation went to war against British colonizers. These members of the Providence Industrial Mission, or PIM, an African independent church founded by Chilembwe, took up arms against the colonizers because they could no longer imagine futures in which they survived on the one hand and British colonialism continued to exist on the other. Inspired by histories from other times and places, stirred by signs and warnings of various kinds, subjected to famine and poverty, and angered by colonial abuses, which were longstanding and new, they put their fates in their God's hands and pursued a different future, come what may. The opening of the new PIM church in 1913, which had been built over the course of about 5 to 6 years, I believe. And you can see the congregation posed in front, and the caption says that this is John Chilembwe over here. I can't confirm that of the author of this piece on that. The uprising began January 23rd, 1915, and lasted only a few days. It involved 3 columns of armed men, all enthusiastic followers of the Reverend John Chilembwe, as described by George Shepperson and Thomas Price, in the important book Independent African, which was published in the 1950s. And these 3 columns killed 3 European planters employed by the A.L. Bruce Estates at Magomero, just 8 miles away from the PIM, and which was a potent symbol of colonial oppression due to its abusive labor practices. They attacked Europeans at 3 additional locations too, another estate, the African Lakes Company in Blantyre, and a Catholic mission at nearby Nguludi. African colonial troops, or Askari, from the King's African Rifles, which was the British colonial army in East Africa, mobilized against the insurrectionists. And some 11 days later, Askari captured and killed Chilembwe as he tried to escape into Portuguese East Africa, or Mozambique today. The colonial government executed 36 insurrectionists by hanging or firing squad, and some 300 people were imprisoned. The PIM's new church, which had only been completed for a year or so at the time of the uprising, was destroyed. As was typical in colonized spaces like Nyasaland, punitive actions against Malawians far outnumbered casualties incurred by the colonizers. Those who followed Chilembwe would have known that colonial retribution would be terrible. They did it anyway. The temporal context of the January 1915 events is important. And so I've put together this little timeline just to in the sequence of events that happened. I was just talking about what happened in Chilembwe's war, which started in January 1915. But actually, it's important to think about what happened ahead of that, or before that, going at least back to 1912, when there was a major famine that occurred throughout Malawi because of crop failure. I mentioned the opening of Chilembwe's church, new church. I'll come to the Battle of Karanga in a bit. This one, October 1914, is just to note the arrival, or not the arrival, but the kind of importance of a prophecy, a prediction that was rendered by Eliot Kamwana, who was one of the first one of the first people to articulate a religious vision for the Watchtower movement in this part of Africa, beginning around 1907. But he predicted that the end of the world would come in October 1914. And of course, this helped to feed into a larger sense of catastrophe that was attached to the arrival of the First World War in August of 1914. So the temporal context is important. In Nyasaland, the First World War had begun just 5 months earlier in August 1914, as elsewhere on the continent, and of course, as in Europe. African peoples in Nyasaland and across the continent came to feel its effects in different ways according to where they lived and worked, as well as when and to what extent colonial armies appeared in their vicinities, fighting the white man's war, or seeking people to recruit or conscript as laborers. For Malawi especially, the war's arrival in 1914 was a manifestation and exacerbation of ongoing crises, a fulfillment of various signs of impending doom. I will say more about this later. I'll come back to the rest of the timeline later as well. Okay, so that was the temporal context. The geographic context is important too. Bordering German East Africa, British Nyasaland was one among many places in the region from which British colonizers sought to meet their labor needs for the war effort. Nyasaland's proximity to German East Africa also heightened British perceptions of a security threat, even as the opportunity for imperial expansion through a future German defeat manifested itself. Nyasaland was also surrounded on all sides by Portuguese East Africa, and by that I mean mostly the southern region that I'm talking about. So borderlands labor and migration histories also helped shape Chilembwe's congregation. Portuguese East Africa was also a fugitive space. Chilembwe died trying to reach Portuguese East Africa as the insurrection was being defeated by the King's African Rifles. Finally, Nyasaland's geography reflected complex, multi-layered histories of violence that produced Chilembwe as a thinker and leader whose anti-colonial message struck a chord precisely for its deep imbrication in these histories. So on these two maps, just again, a reminder of the geopolitical colonial arrangement, and to kind of orient you again to the First World War in East Africa. You can see on this map, Tanganyika or German East Africa is here, and then here is Nyasaland, here is Mozambique. And the importance of this map is really just indicated by those dark arrows, which show all of the allies united to encroach on German East Africa in order to ultimately conquer it. This dotted line that you can see here shows the way that the German colonial army maneuvered in order to try and escape from that invasion that was coming from all sides. And you can see that it was an extensive campaign. I won't go into further detail on that, but except to say that the surrender took place finally in November of 1918 in Northern Rhodesia, today Zambia, at this location. Okay, so this talk then considers what Chilembwe and his followers imagined for themselves in January 1915 while the world went to war. I look at what they were willing to do in pursuit of a different world, a different future, with or without white colonizers and settlers, or white supremacy, or the brutal extractive economies that limited Malawians' abilities to control their lives and labor in ways that mattered to them. In this way, it offers a history of the First World War that prioritizes anti-colonial resistance and sovereignties alongside the violent everyday mobilization of Black people for wartime labor. As the war provoked the colonizers to find new ways of exploiting the peoples of Nyasaland, Chilembwe enjoined members of his congregation to communicate their refusal of further abuses or to die trying. Okay, so just a little bit of an overview to let you know where I'm going with this. I've wrapped up kind of the introductory section, and from here I'll talk about Chilembwe and his followers, which will then lead me to talking a bit more in more detail about the Battle of Karonga, and then I'll offer some concluding thoughts. So Chilembwe's uprising has been quite well studied, and I can say more about this in the Q&A if people are interested in knowing more about the sources I'm working with or the historiography, but I'll forego that for the moment. So let me just turn to Chilembwe and those who answered his call for war against the colonizers. Although he became widely known because of the 1915 uprising, his anti-colonial consciousness had actually been building for quite some time. This image shows him during his time in Lynchburg, Virginia, where he attended seminary for 3 years. He returned to Nyasaland in 1900 and established the Providence Industrial Mission after a 3-year stay in the US. So I'll come back to this, but I'll just provide a bit more of his biography since I think it's quite important for understanding what led him to his actions in 1915. He was born around 1870, probably quite near where the PIM ended up being built. The area was described by Shepperson and Price, the historians I mentioned earlier, as a, quote, particularly troubled area that was raided over by all and sundry, unquote. Chilembwe's father was a Yao. These were peoples who were associated with long distance trading, including slave trading in Eastern Africa, Eastern and Southeastern Africa. They were Muslims and they were quite powerful in the region in terms of governance and distribution of wealth. His mother was Manganja, and who were one of the peoples who were sometimes harmed by people like the Yao, people who were sometimes enslaved, and his perspective may have been shaped by both of these social lineages. For the sake of time, I won't go deeply into the history of this region, except to say that this was the land of David Livingstone's and many others' missionizing activities starting in the 1850s, a land where raids and settlement by Ngoni peoples from Southern Africa had wreaked havoc on those who already lived there, a place where Portuguese processes of land alienation caused people to move in search of other opportunities, a land where peoples victimized by slavery, such as Chilembwe's mother, where those people lived alongside Yao middlemen in regional slave trading networks. He grew up in the midst of the district's, quote, rumors of war and slavery and its prevailing atmosphere of insecurity, unquote, Shepperson and Price again. And I say all of this in order to kind of connect to other areas that I've studied, especially German East Africa, where similar patterns of violence existed that resemble the ones that I've just described. Around 1892, Chilembwe found work as a so-called cook boy employed by the radical Scottish missionary John Booth to care for his young daughter, Emily. The time that he spent as a domestic servant to John Booth's family was a form of education to work, and it also gave Chilembwe an intimate perspective on a European household. He was entrusted with the care of Booth's children, nursing them back to health after bouts of malaria and ensuring their everyday safety. He learned to handle a gun during this time as well, in order to defend Booth's mission. Interestingly enough, he was defending Booth's mission from other white missionaries who were angered by Booth's radical message, which I'll come back to in a moment. But they threatened to burn the mission down, and so that led Booth to armed Chilembwe and another domestic servant named David. And so Chilembwe in particular became a very skilled gun handler, and later he became a big game hunter. So that's one component of his profile that I find really interesting. In addition, he spoke a couple of languages before he undertook mission education. Again, this is quite common in this part of the continent. But so he began to learn English, it steadily improved, and he took on more of an interpreter roles, which of course then gave him an additional source of power within the colonial context. Chilembwe became John Booth's first convert in 1893 in a total immersion baptism. And Chilembwe's labor as a domestic servant then opened the door to his conversion. And Booth's radicalism, especially his vocal support for the notion of Africa and Africa for the Africans in a book of the same name, surely contributed to Chilembwe's sense of what it could mean to be an African Christian. He was, of course, part of a much larger cohort of mission-educated African Christians who found inspiration in what is known as Ethiopianism. Some scholars kind of refer to that as a form of Black nationalism, and I think there's something to that. But I also think we could describe it as a kind of reaching for African inspiration for spiritual living. Now, so you've been looking at this picture for a while, and I mentioned a little bit earlier that Chilembwe spent time in the United States from 1897 to 1900, where he attended seminary. And he probably strengthened some of the sensibilities that he had begun to develop while still with John Booth. He had actually traveled to the US with John Booth, but they soon went their separate ways. Chilembwe's ties to African-American Baptists at the seminary where he studied gave him new sources of moral, financial, and emotional support, while Booth's ability to raise money was actually declining at this time. So Chilembwe developed friendships with African-American missionaries who came to Nyasaland soon thereafter to assist with the founding of the Providence Industrial Mission, and those friendships remained active in that first decade of the 20th century. So this is a very interesting part of Chilembwe's life that I would like to continue to learn about. So I just learned, for example, that in 2020, this historical marker was placed in Lynchburg to commemorate John Chilembwe's time there. And there's this interesting line here that reminds readers and visitors that the British blamed some of Chilembwe's radicalism on the education that he received in the United States. So this is an intriguing kind of time and place that I would like to continue to look at, especially since this kind of diasporic trans-imperial emergence of a kind of radical politics would seem to call out for more analysis. I'll show you this image too before I move on to this part. So this is a little booklet that I found digitized in archive.org, which is one of those kind of booklets that gives biographical profiles of many people who are involved in missionary work through the National Baptist Convention of the United States of America. And two of the images in there stand out for me, of course, for this project. I'll start here. First, there's Chilembwe with a short biographical description of him. There's no year on this document, so I can't really tell exactly when it was published, but clearly it was after the building of the PIM. I don't know if it was after the uprising, so this is interesting too. The middle picture shows Ida Chilembwe, who was John Chilembwe's wife. And there again, you can see that the text explains that she's flanked by two so-called native helpers that she trained. The reason I think that this is important is that, first of all, this history cries out for a gendered analysis, which I have not yet had much time to do. But I think this image also evokes the point that the Chilembwes were participants in kind of a respectable class of African pastors and missionaries who were reliant on some of the same kinds of class and status markers that their fellow white missionaries were also involved in. So this is an interesting image that I would also like to think about. Okay, back to the timeline briefly. So I mentioned that the PIM, that Chilembwe returned to Malawi and started the PIM somewhere around 1900. And the missionary model that he used was based on principles that were at least a century old of self-help and self-support. And there's, again, much more for me to do here in terms of trying to figure out more about his theology and how it tied into that industrial in the Providence Industrial Mission. He, during that first 10 years before that first decade of being back in Malawi, he began to develop some strong anti-colonial sentiments that had to do with his observation of African soldiers being deployed, soldiers from Nyasaland being deployed to imperial wars that were being fought elsewhere on the continent. So for example, they were sent to fight in the Ashanti Wars. They went to fight in Somaliland. And he, this became kind of an anchor in his rhetoric, that he found it upsetting that soldiers were shedding blood for imperial causes. He also increasingly began to speak out against the experiences of congregation members on plantations and estates that were proximate to the PIM. So I showed you the Bruce estates that were about 8 miles away. So certainly within the orbit of the PIM. He also received African American missionaries during this time who assisted with the making of PIM and its congregation. In 1913, his new church, the one that was on the very first picture I showed you on the title slide, so quite a magnificent, striking structure, was completed. 2 years later, it lay in ruins, destroyed by the colonial government in the aftermath of Chilembwe's rebellion. Okay, so I've spoken quite a bit about Chilembwe, and I want to just say a bit more about his followers, and this will be a much shorter section because I know a lot less about them. But I think it's really important, again, to kind of build out this social context that within which he was operating as he moved to asking his congregation to go to war. So I think we can classify them in sort of two groups. There were the educated elites who were aligned with the colonial administration in certain ways, participants in missions, business owners, et cetera, who were complex people. They were seeking freedom along at the same time that they were part of this kind of black-white colonizer colonized binary. They were also patriarchs who were invested in respectability and industry, and it's very hard actually to find women in these histories. And so again, the gendered analysis is we are in need of more gendered analysis. The second group were workers on plantations who were especially Nguru youth and men and women whose involvement in the uprising stemmed from violence and abuse that they suffered as workers, as well as one of the proprietors of the estate's refusal to allow kind of satellite churches and schools to focus on the estates and actively destroying them. So these were people who lived under kind of police and military scrutiny. They experienced unfair labor practices and other, there were participants in Chilembwe's congregation, but they also had these other lives that were kind of set in their work environment on the estates. So these were all people who had grown up with the harshness of colonial rule, but they also realized other potentials through missions and government employment in the midst of the echoes and hauntings of the violent past that affected the region. They crossed status hierarchies, and their relational positions within with the colonizers varied according to the kind of work that they did. So, again, the gendered analysis needs to follow. I can talk more about what I know of kind of masculinities and the relational kind of gendering of society if people are interested in the Q&A. Okay, so again, going back to the timeline here, in November of, Battle of Karanga happens in September of 1914. I mentioned earlier Kamwana's, who was the kind of person most notably involved with Watchtower expansion in from around 1907 to 1908. He said that the world was going to end in October 1914. Shortly thereafter, Chilembwe wrote a letter that he intended to have published in the Nyasaland Times, which ended up being censored and not published, not circulated, but it has survived through the archives. And then the insurrection happens at the end of January. Okay, so to talk about the Battle of Karanga for a bit, this was one of the first battles in Africa's First World War, which was fought in northern Nyasaland, kind of the tip of Lake Malawi, right at the border with German East Africa. So here, you can, this is a very basic, but essentially what happened in the battle was that German forces crossed over into Nyasaland, and military engagements happened around here. Ultimately, the Nyasaland troops were able to push the Germans back out and hold that area. But it was an intense battle. And it also illustrates in microcosm how the war affected everyday life in Nyasaland. So in answering the question, what does Chilembwe's war have to do with the First World War? Karanga is kind of a pivot point. Before the battle, it represented Malawi's histories of colonial encroachment and violence. After the battle, it became one of Chilembwe's key motivators. The battle itself disrupted the lives of Malawians in specific ways, which I'll explain shortly. Chilembwe had long been troubled, as I said, with the employment of African soldiers in far-off campaigns, which in his mind, and of course it was true, these military actions had little significance for peoples of the Nyasa region. He was especially disturbed about the Battle of Karanga against the Germans, where over 100 African Africans lost their lives fighting on both sides, both for German East Africa and for Nyasaland, in a war that had very little relevance to them. Chilembwe's critique of the war expressed a sense of the war as a malevolent force in the lives of ordinary Malawians. His analysis in the letter that I just mentioned is extraordinarily acute, I think, and this is a source that deserves much wider attention. So I've just excerpted a bit of the letter here. It's actually 3 times as long as this excerpt. But I've highlighted in blue some of the places where I think he's really bringing out some of the key criticisms that could be made of African peoples being deployed into these battles and in these settings where there was no clear benefit to them to participate. So I won't read this, but if you just look at those blue portions, those kind of get at the key critiques. For those who lived in Nyasaland, the specific effects of the war and the ones that most urgently infused politics in the Shire highlands where Chilembwe's church was situated emerged from the pressures of forced labor recruitment, especially for porters who really had to carry everything, all of the military equipment, their supplies, goods, etc. So there was a constant demand for porters during the war. While extractive colonial labor practices predated the war and a full spectrum of African labor practices predated the colonizers, World War I produced intensive new demands and conditions that suggested wider, deeper, and deadly extractive horizons. The rumors and prophecies of the end of the world that had been circulating since 1907 because of Watchtower informed the local discourses about the Battle of Karonga and beyond. This is kind of where where World War I and Karonga as one of the first engagements of the war kind of comes into contact with knowledge of the abuses that were happening on estates like the one at Magomero, Bruce Estate. And so this kind of powerful discourse underpins the move to violence at the end of January on the part of Chilembwe and his congregation. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to move to my concluding thoughts because I want to make sure that we have lots of time for questions. All right, so back to the picture of the Providence Industrial Mission. I started thinking about Chilembwe's war again for 2 reasons. I mean, this is something that I learned about in graduate school, but I hadn't ever studied it that closely. So for 2 reasons, I've returned to it. Chilembwe's war is an especially effective entry point into narrating histories of Africa and World War I that center African perspectives and that highlight the interwovenness of military labor, social, cultural, economic, gender, and religious aspects that bring African histories of World War I into global histories more effectively. And 2, millenarian movements and moments reveal some of the factors shaping how people perceive and respond to persistent oppression through religion, expressive culture, and organic intellectual praxis that does not defer to or explain itself to the colonizers. And I think that this is an important way into thinking about World War I as an African war waged by African peoples. I confess that when I began this work with the goal of better understanding a different World War I context from the one I knew best, just across the imperial border with German East Africa, I was thinking of Chilembwe and his followers in the same vein as Maji Maji and other prophetic millenarian movements. So Maji Maji was a war that was fought, an anti-colonial war that was fought against the Germans between 1905 and 1907, in which similar kinds of rhetoric around the end of the world played a significant part. So the people who participated in Maji Maji chose death in the cause of liberation. But as I read more, I came to see even more in Chilembwe's story. His experience of growing up in a place roiled by regional slave trading networks and the violence and displacement they caused undoubtedly shaped his decision to seek out employment among the Europeans. Joseph Booth's household became the site of his conversion, as well as his training for entering the small intermediary class of Africans whose proximity to whiteness granted them relative privilege within colonized society. In traveling to the US for religious training, he learned from African-American thinkers whose post-Reconstruction lives undoubtedly shaped his views of British colonialism. And perhaps he influenced the African-American missionaries too. Upon his return to Nyasaland as the founder of an African independent church, as a family man, as host of African-American missionaries who visited the PIM, as head of the PIM congregation, he came to see the violence of the colonial order more acutely and across more dimensions. So I've kind of come to think, I'm using Catherine McKittrick's work here. I've kind of come to think of Chilembwe's War as a kind of, quote, method making in which the goal is not to find liberation, but to seek it out, unquote. Chilembwe's actions provided a different way to think about what might otherwise have seemed futile, but which actually was putting the pieces in place for a different future for Malawians. So this is my last thought here. Another avenue that I would like to explore further is the rich history of expressive culture in Malawi that offered alternative spaces for its peoples to connect beyond the colonizers' eyes and ears, despite the violence that surrounded them. And that many of these dance cultures and secret societies were clearly influenced by practices of military drill is a provocative example of the tissue that links Chilembwe's war with the World War in Africa. Colonizers were very nervous about these expressive cultures and their implications, and rightly so, since they embodied the spirit, the radical potential of January 1915, expressed in locally meaningful modes that continued despite the colonizers' security concerns, helping Malawians to survive each new manifestation of colonial abuse, even as they looked to a different future. So I'll stop there and invite your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moyd. That was a very inspiring talk. And there's already two questions, and I will also have questions, but I will first start with Dr. Pin's question. And in fact, there's more than two, but let's start with the first one, if I could get it, if my computer let me. Okay, so the first question, and I think it's a very interesting one because it was, this idea was also coming to my mind. Is there evidence that the support Chilembwe received from independent Black churches also include theological vocabulary and grammar for articulating African resistance and the redemption suggested by Ethiopianism?
Suggested by what? I'm sorry.
Oh, suggested by Ethiopianism.
Oh, Ethiopianism, got it. Thank you. I think, so I haven't closely analyzed Chilembwe's own texts yet, and it's not, he did write a few things like this, but I haven't studied them all yet. I think further in this document, he does evoke God, and he does kind of talk about, he refers to people as Africans in a kind of generalized way, right? So there does seem to be a consciousness of, or a sensibility around a shared condition in colonialism. But the Ethiopianism label is one that historians have applied to him afterwards, as far as I can tell. So, and that's extrapolating out of Booth's Booth being on the radical edge of white missionary activity and politics, in as much as he was a pacifist and he believed that Africans should be able to self-determine as they participated in this Christian life, right? So, so I think there's more to do for sure on my part. I think other historians have probably looked more closely at his theology. I'm not quite ready to say one way or the other, but this the idea of reaching for, I think I put it that way in my talk, reaching for connection across African experiences of spirituality and religion is one that is not unique to Chilembwe in this moment. There's, there are many churches, independent churches in South Africa, for example, that are making these appeals as well. And I mean, the Ethiopia reference point, of course, is that Ethiopia has had Christianity for many centuries, right? So it's not. So that's why it's a touchstone in these independent churches reaching for an African source of Christian inspiration, I suppose.
Thank you. So here's the second question. Is it possible that during his time in the US and in relationship to his familiarity with Black churches, Chilembwe would have become familiar with the religious Black nationalism of radical church figures like Henry McNeill Turner?
I'm not familiar with that figure, but I do think anything is possible. He was there for 3 years and he traveled a bit. I think he spent some time in Philadelphia, if I'm not mistaken. So I think there's much more work to be done on kind of understanding how African-American missionaries were passing through places like the Virginia Seminary, and who he might have interacted with. But he did have sustained relationships with a couple of particular African-American Baptist missionaries who made kind of multiple trips to Malawi for short stays. So I would be interested in knowing more about the figure you mentioned, because I'm not familiar with that person. But I think this question of who is influencing who is an interesting one, because certainly before Chilembwe went to Virginia, he had already experienced kind of this radical form of this radical Christian theology through Booth, and was certainly attuned to the kind of social justice, if you want to use that anachronistically, interests that Booth had. So what did he bring with him to the seminary, and what did the Baptists give him? I think that's an open question still, for me anyway.
Thank you so much. I see that you really have given a lot to Dr. Pins, because he's thinking a lot of things through those questions. And the last questions, that we have also from Dr. Pins, still about Black church figures. So the question is, Black church figures and church thinking he may have encountered in the US during the period often advanced responses to Black suffering, entailing a Black nationalist take on the theodicy of redemptive suffering. Is there anything similar in this theological platform?
I don't think so. What I've read, and again, I'm working with very few texts so far. So there are these kinds of texts where Chilembwe is very kind of strident about this, about the unfairness and brutality of colonialism, and which is motivating him then to oppose the colonizers vocally through publication, and then a few months later to actually convince people to take up arms. It doesn't seem to me to be he doesn't seem to be talking about redemption or suffering in what I've seen. And then, the other things that I'm working with are testimonies that were collected after the uprising was suppressed, brutally suppressed by the King's African Rifles. So people were kind of recalling what they had witnessed in Chilembwe's church and what was being practiced, or what kinds of sermons he gave and that sort of thing. And they sort of said that he wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary. I mean, he was giving ordinary sermons, and he was doing the same things that other pastors seem to be doing. But obviously these things lend themselves to closer readings, and I would like to do that. I would like to spend more time doing that. But this document, when I gave this talk a few days ago, somebody asked me the same thing. I mean, is there anything in this letter, for example, that suggests more about his theology? And there really isn't. There's, like, at the very end, there's sort of an appeal to God, but it's not threaded throughout.
Thank you. So I will have a kind of more general question, because I found Chilembwe's figure very fascinating, in the sense that, when you think about anti-colonialism and post-colonial theory, there's always this idea, as Audre Lorde has put it with a particular article, like the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. But in Chilembwe's case, in fact, he went to the US, gets some particular teaching, theory, theology, then went back, and then suddenly had a whole different vision about British colonialism. So I really believe that studying a character like Chilembwe's help us reframe our ideas about, what it means supposedly to be a subaltern and to be in contact with a language or teaching which is not traditionally from Africa. So I would like you to tell me what your thought on that.
Yeah, I like the way that you put that. And I also find that sort of turn interesting. And I'm interested that it seems to turn on his keying into the unfairness, the paradox of using Black soldiers to fight these imperial wars, right? Which of course is one of the contradictions that I'm most interested in my own work, and have been for a long time. And also that he seems to have, I didn't go into this as much in this talk today, but I'm really interested in the fact that he seems to have taken on his role as a marksman, somebody who works with guns, not only as somebody who provides security to Booth's family, but later on that he becomes a big game hunter. So he kind of crosses this, sort of status. He moves across statuses, because that elite game hunting place, well, there are different ways you can think of it, right? He could have been part of other African traditions and practices of big game hunting that already existed in that region. But he also seems to have been doing it in the same time and place as people like Teddy Roosevelt, right, who famously started doing this at that time. So anyway, I guess what I'm trying to say is that there's something compelling to me here about a sort of martial masculinity that he's that matters to him, and that he is trying to use as an entry point into confronting the colonial state and its contradictions. And then alongside that, the fact that these youth and people who have been forced to flee from Portuguese East Africa due to violence and abuses, labor abuses there, find work on plantations in Malawi, and then begin to experience an intensification of labor abuses and violence there. So those two things become his kind of focal points for constructing an anti-colonial critique over that decade. I mean, it's not just in response to Karanga that it seems to build through that first decade, and perhaps is heightened by Watchtower pacifist ideas that are circulating. He does not seem to have taken on Watchtower theologies in his own preaching, but I think it's, it makes sense to kind of understand him as participating in a moment where there are lots of spiritual possibilities for expressing frustration and injury due to colonialism and its labor abuses. Thank you. That's a great question.
Thank you so much. And I really like, this kind of formulation that you have spiritual possibilities, because then I really believe that your work shows so many layers. So you have the gender aspect that, I was thinking of when you talk about Chilembwe, but also his wife. You have also this idea of agency, because, he worked with Booth, and then he went to the US and then he went back to Africa. So you have all this kind of intracultural, international elements. I don't want to use intersectionality because this has been used and misused so many times, but why can you do this with all these intersections of religions, but also what you term spiritual possibilities for someone to decide to go beyond and to see what is unjust and to decide to fight against it?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. I mean, you've definitely put your finger on my problem with this project, which is that because I'm using it sort of as a lens into the exact reason that I'm using it is because it is so rich with possibilities for understanding African perspectives on the war, but also in the war, and kind of what the experience of being in a place where World War I is kind of determining a lot of the socioeconomic conditions, what it is that people are doing on an everyday basis to continue to exist, to make choices about how they're going to participate or not in the economy. And so I find Chilembwe's actions fascinating for that reason. So let me see if I can find a sensible way to talk about it in terms of the intersectional. I mean, one interesting piece of what Chilembwe gave directions to the men who went out and killed Europeans, especially on that first couple of days of the insurrection. And one of the instructions he gave was that he didn't want any women or children, white women or children, harmed in as they went out to undertake these actions. And so, I'm thinking about that in terms of obviously a gendered and racialized sense of what is appropriate in this moment as an expression of anger and frustration with colonial abuses. To just add some further gruesomeness to the story, one of the estate's managers who was murdered, he was beheaded and his head was taken back to Chilembwe's church. And, apparently Chilembwe then also preached kind of standing right beside it. So there, that is a very rich tableau to explore in terms of what's going on with the performance of violence across race, as well as the gendered implications of kill the men, but don't harm the women and children. So that would be one place I think would be a possibility for doing a kind of intersectional analysis. But yeah, there's a lot. And I've also been thinking about, the nature of performative violence like this. Why is it that, you murder people, but then why do you also need this show of extra? I have a friend who's now passed, but a political scientist who calls this extra lethal violence. What is that? What is being asked of people when they view something like that,
Thank you so much. I cannot wait to read the upcoming, book chapter and eventually book on that topic, because it's very rich. And I really believe that sometimes if, there's no clear answers, that's it. Because this person was so complex, and this period, you already show that this period is not what we think it is.
Yeah.
So I think as such, that's already a great accomplishment. So thank you for answering all these questions, for coming, today to join us and share your thoughts on Chilembwe's war. And as I said, I cannot wait to read more work on this topic.
Thank you.
I don't think there's more questions, so I think we let you go.
I appreciate these, especially yours, Dr. Pin, for giving me some more things to think about in terms of the religious piece, which is very important. So,
thank you for everyone for joining us, and you know that this whole thing could cut abruptly.
Thank you.